Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Shrink Think, which is produced by the Association for MPD and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment, Research, and Education. I am Sandra Brown, and I'm joined by my co-host, Chelli Pumphrey. Hey, Chelli.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back.
I know we've been on a pause, holidays, all that. So it's good to be back. Why don't you say a little bit about what you do so people know you?
Sure. I am a licensed professional counselor, and I specialize in working with narcissistic abuse, pathological love relationships, and trauma. And I'm also the author of Insight is 2020, How to Trust Yourself to Protect Yourself from Narcissistic Abuse and Toxic Relationships. And we are here today to talk about that subject, of course.
That's right. So today we've been focusing that the whole purpose of this series has been to focus on common treatment errors that we are not fitting with field theory. We understand why people get off track. This is a relatively new field, and so they grab things from that might have worked in general trauma treatment or other types of victimizations, and that don't always mesh with true field theory in this population. And so the common treatment error that we're going to be talking about today is codependency. And you and I, before we came on screen, were talking about this as probably our number one pet peeve.
Number one, for sure.
Yeah. So since we're big haters, why don't you say what you don't like about it?
Well, codependency, it's such a term. This term is like a household term. I feel like everybody can use that term or has kind of this general sense of what that might mean. And it might have been useful, I don't know, in the 70s or 80s, whenever it became popular with Melody Beattie, with her book Codependent No More. And, at that time, it made sense. And it was also really connected to this addiction model. And in that time, I mean, we're talking however many years, 40 years or so. I don't know when that came out, but first of all, the mental health field has evolved enormously in that time, as well as the addiction field. And so, what's happened is that word, that idea of codependency has stayed back there, in my opinion. And even though we're here in 2023, we're still using this term as it's like this blanket term that just is used to describe any kind of boundary lacking, enmeshed.
Right.
I don't know. There's all these weird ideas about what codependency means, but
Right.
Unfortunately, it gets placed in our field here with psychopaths and narcissists, pathological love relationships, and it just doesn't have a place here.
Yeah. I know. I always use the analogy that it's like a stretched out pair of pantyhose. Like you said, there's been so much new science. I don't know if the psychology field has ever grown as much with the onset of neuroscience and neurobiology, and attachment theories really ramped up. And that word, it could mean a million things. You could be use that word codependent and be thinking in your mind that it has some correlation to attachment. I could use that word and I'm thinking about more trauma symptoms, and it's to me so broad and so general and so stretched out that it holds no clinical identity other than poor boundaries. But we have much more science now to get down underneath that to real clinical roots of it. That the person might actually have dependent personality disorder. It could be a trauma response. It could be attachment issues. When we say that, we're not being specific enough, I don't think. And I don't think it gives us any clinical guidance to get to the roots. And I was telling you before we went on air with that, when we had the really big counseling center, we used to work with some of the colleges and had interns, and they weren't allowed to use that word. It was just lazy. I want to get down to the diagnostics here. We're not using this stretched out word that means absolutely anything, because what are we really saying?
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think what I get really frustrated by, and I know we'll kind of talk further about this, but is this, if we just look at our field in particular here and dealing with PLRs, when people are trying to say, okay, just fix your codependent patterns, and they're coming at it from this umbrella, broad kind of sense, they are not understanding or treating what the root cause is. And if you don't know what the root cause is, you're going to be spinning your wheels and ending up in these relationships again and again. And unfortunately, that's probably one of the biggest things I see with other therapists and coaches doing is teaching about codependency. Heal your codependent patterns and make this all better. And it just doesn't do it justice.
And, just as a reminder, there is a reason in 40 years that the DSM has not included that.
Right.
So while 10 million copies of that book has been sold and there's no backing up the truck to snatch that understanding out, it doesn't mean we as clinicians need to use something that is so non-distinct, and that doesn't help us get to the etiology. That's just a surface manifestation of symptoms. And it doesn't help us on an etiological level to get to what we're actually treating. And what do you treat? How do you treat codependency? They go to 12-step groups for the rest of their life because we never got to the root.
Right. So I think, moving forward here today, one of the things that we wanted to talk about is, in your research, this idea of super traits and how it is often one of the biggest roots of what looks like codependent patterns in survivors. So I'd love for you to introduce us to the kind of how this plays out and how we get so confused about it.
So back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, and I was like looking at this 30-some years ago, I brought what I knew, and I was trained in psychopathology. I'd worked with personality disordered people before I started working with the survivors. And so psychopathology is a very different kind of training, different division, if you will, in psychology that is very personality centered. And I also was trauma trained, so I brought my trauma knowledge and trained in domestic violence. And so as the people I was treating in the personality disorder clinic, of course, their relationships are horrible. And they began to bring their survivor partners in as the identified problem. And because my particular training in psychopathology and specifically personality disorders is so personality oriented, my first natural inclination in looking at them was looking at personality. So that was that's my strongest training is in psychopathology, even beyond trauma. So I would look for the trauma and I look for the DV stuff, but at the core of my thinking was always about personality. And so this was back in the late 80s or early 90s. So codependency was all the rage. And the book was Codependent No More was out, all of that. And I kept trying on the things on that, trying to get to the core of where these behaviors were being generated. And the codependency thing, or dependency for that matter, didn't fit. And so many of these women were doctors, air traffic controller, professors. And if you really believe in the issue about codependency as dependent personality disorder light, if you will, those are debilitating conditions that prevent people a lot of times from living their full life. And yet here I had all of these women that were not codependent, except in this one pathological relationship. So was that really codependency, or was that more a reflection possibly of personality functioning, which is again a deeper look. Instead of taking the stretched out pantyhose and just slapping codependency on there, going deeper and taking a look at personality and how that affected them. And so that's how it started 30 some years ago. And I just kept doing surveys with them. And then we got into some testing using the TCI, which is the temperament character inventory. We did that with, and then we went on to Purdue. And so these little surveys I was doing and my personality science training, thinking, and then using the TCI led us to go to Purdue University and knock on their door and say, I have this hunch that what is, at the core of not only getting into these relationships, but the difficulty about disengaging isn't necessarily dependency or codependency. I think it's a personality trait that pathological people sort of target. They like these people that are wired this way. And if we can understand how the majority of these people are wired, then again, ideologically, we can work at the personality awareness level. While we're not likely to make big changes in personality, which is why we're not real successful in personality disorder treatment, these women are not pathologically personality disorder. They have some quirks in their personality that, with some what I call chaperoning, the ability to pay attention to these traits, not only in targeting, but how they tend to interact when there is pathology in the room, that they could learn to have better management, especially in prevention around that. And so it behooved me to reject back then the stretched out pantyhose and not go with that model, or we would have never found these research outcomes that we call super traits of personality. It has more to do, not necessarily with their history, but their personality proclivities. And so, you know, Purdue humored me. They're like, well, I don't know if you're going to get what you think you're going to get. And having already used the TCI, I said, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be here. And so the outcomes was that 63% of the survivors did not have codependency. They had these personality trait elevations in several domains of personality, but two that we really connected to: the targeting and the difficulty and disengagement in the relationships. And the rest is history, you know, because when we use that super trait model with these survivors, they so identify with that. They spent, you know, 10 years sitting in coded groups and never got better, and kept thinking, this isn't me, this isn't me, I'm not codependent. I mean, there's something going on, but that's, you know, that's not it. And the ability to work with them with the personality proclivities that are elevated personality traits that need some work, it is just really, to me, miraculous. And the difference in their ability to, I mean, it's certainly not the only thing that needs treatment in these relationships. There's a lot of trauma, you know, if they had a lot of ACE events back in the day, there's all of that to clean up. But once the trauma is cleaned up and the cognitive dissonance is reduced and they're not being highly reactivated in trauma, and they're able to really focus on these elevated personality trait proclivities, the turnaround is amazing. And it's the only thing that I have seen that works in prevention about getting back into these relationships.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's fascinating to see it through this lens, because yes, I mean, even as you said, Purdue humored you to do that study, because most of us don't look at that. And I also think, just in general, the study of personality is, you know, that it really is a specialty in psychology, just like psychopathology is as well. So we get these basic things in our, you know, educational programs, and then that's it. So it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind, unless you're really looking into it like you did.
Know, a lot of people, you know, have asked me, how did you ever figure out, you know, this whole thing, pathological relationships that they call narcissistic abuse? And honest to God, it's just, I had the weird mixture of training, having been trained in psychopathology. And if you're going to work in personality disorders, you get more training in personality. And then I had, you know, trauma training too. And it was that mixture, you know, of being trained at that level that theoretically, on a theory level, just really came together. And again, I think, you know, the proof is not only in the outcome from Purdue, it is in what happens in treatment with these women when you're actually getting to the real issue,
Right.
Which is personality proclivity. And so, again, you know, 63%, that's a big chunk. You know, who are the other 30-some% of those. And a lot of those are the ones, that have the predicted background.
Right.
Everybody tends to think that, all of these survivors have horrendous, ACE event and traumatic backgrounds. And that was another thing that made me look at personality, because so many of the survivors would have scored really low on the ACE. They didn't have proclaimed histories. And so that, if I was going to run at it with trauma, and they don't have all of that, they have current trauma from the PLR, but they don't have historical trauma.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so if it's not trauma, okay, I got to set that over here. What else can, I look at? And again, with my training and personality, I thought it's what's left.
Right. Right.
It's got to be personality.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
Well,
and so
go ahead.
Of the people, a lot of them have those predictable, and I think we talked about that on another show, the ones that do have developmental trauma or complex PTSD that fit the model that we expect. And
Right.
that's the problem, is that we have entered into this therapy with people, out of these relationships with those assumptions that it has to be trauma-based, when for a big percentage of them, it wasn't developmental trauma-based, it's current trauma. We enter into it from having read bloggers with no clinical background that paste up codependency because they can go look up something out of Melody Beatty's book and somehow weave it in. We run at this thing, with codependency as well. And we've missed, really what the data, to quote Brene Brown, what the data shows. And what the data shows is that you're going to be dealing, 63% of them are going to have personality proclivities that need work, not codependency that needs work.
Yeah. Well, I thought, I know that you brought a chart where we could look at some of the side-by-side comparisons of codependency and super traits. So maybe I can attempt to share this right now. Let's see if I can make this work. Okay. My technical skills are.
You're higher than I am.
I have too many things available there. Okay, here we go. Let's see if we can do this. Okay, are we seeing the chart?
You need to, yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So we're gonna do a follow-up video where we go deeper into the super traits, and we'll spend a lot more time talking about these trait elevations, in the trait of agreeableness and the trait of conscientiousness. But just to bring this point home for today on this video is to be able to look at this comparison. So this is out of our Women Who Love Psychopaths book, lots of chapters on super traits of personality in there if you want to read more. And so the women had this trait elevation in what is often called agreeableness. In the TCI, it was called cooperativeness. And this is the one that always gets mistaken for codependency. And so we're actually going to start on the right side under codependency. So as we all know, codependency is known for caretaking kinds of behaviors. And in extreme cases, it's actually dependency or dependent personality. But the women who have agreeableness are reciprocal in relationships, which means given in return. Codependency is not really reciprocal, it's manipulative. In the caretaking. In codependency, so much of it is identified as them really trying, even in the caretaking, attempting to control people. Whereas in agreeableness, while it might look similar, not being generated out of the same issue of codependency. They are willing to help without desire for selfish domination. They have concern for social harmony. That's what's motivating their behavior. They're not attempting to control. That is the motivation behind codependency. They are motivated out of concern for social harmony. In codependency, there is a lack of trust of self and others. In agreeableness, very trusting, and they are very trustworthy as well. In codependency, a lot of those symptoms are really anger, but yet in agreeableness, they are known to be well-tempered and gentle. These are not angry people. They might be by the time you get them after pathological relationship, but that is not their personality. And let's see, in codependency, they have unmoderated feelings. They have a lot of intense and vacillating feelings. In agreeableness, one of the key features of them is their level of tolerance. And so the same thing applies in the next trait, in conscientiousness. And again, in codependency, there's that people pleasing, but in conscientiousness, these are very self-confident people at the personality level. Problem is, by the time we see them in treatment, slather some current trauma on top of them, and the personality doesn't look like what it is at the core. And again, that's a difference in personality science training as opposed to just looking at the presentation symptom. In codependency, there's the attempting to control. In conscientiousness, they are actually very thoughtful with others. In codependency, there's poor communication. In conscientiousness, they are very purposeful and have very goal-directed behavior. In codependency, again, that anger and vacillating feelings. In conscientiousness, my God, these have the most controlled impulse of anyone, other than maybe OCD people, that you can measure. In codependency, there's low self-esteem. In conscientiousness, what they are known for is, before the PLR, having high levels of self-acceptance. Again, in the 63%, not in the people with developmental trauma. And in codependency, very often they feel like they can't meet their own needs, whereas in conscientiousness, what they had prided themselves on before the trauma has reduced their functionality, is being really resourceful and persevering. And so you slather on, some trauma and what the presentation looks like, and we go running at that with only trauma in our hand, or only this concept of codependency, and maybe not enough personality training, we're going to do what the bloggers have done and misinterpret those personality factors. Yeah.
Right. I think it's so helpful. And you know, as you were going down the two columns there, I was imagining these little offshoots on the codependency side, you know, as we've talked about, like here we have super traits being compared, but there are also these other factors that can also contribute to what that codependency looks like. Excuse me, I have something stuck in my throat. You know, I think, I mean, you already alluded to a lot of that, but we're just looking at that umbrella term of codependency. It could be attachment issues. I mean, this is something that I'm really looking at and, you know, doing some research on around codependency can look a lot like an anxious attachment or a disorganized attachment style, for example, or you just, you know, slather on a bunch of trauma. Like, you know, you can look like the 37% we've got here. So that's, you know,
Right.
again, this is why it's so important to get to the core of what's causing this codependency looking
Right.
behavior.
Yeah. And you know, last night I did a call with some survivors, and one of them brought up and asked, have you looked at what looks like codependency that is actually cognitive dissonance?
Yes.
And that might have a presentation overlap as well.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, we got to dig into that too.
Mhm.
But
Lots of research to be done here
yeah,
still.
yeah. So again, personality plays such, I think, such a role in this. And especially when we think about, you know, what is so highlighted in personality disorders is personality non-development that created the disorders. And then sort of on the woo-woo level, this personality being attracted to, because personalities do attract. And I'm not saying law of attraction that they're attracting that, but very much, you know, the personality disorder people told me who they look for and why they looked for that.
Right, right.
And so if we're all up about, you know, personality disorders, and that's what narcissistic abuse is about, but we hardly ever talk about the personality disorder behind the behaviors. Bloggers post all this, he does this and he does that, and we've lost the factor about the personality disorder itself and the personality. And it's probably why as this field has exploded, that we've stopped talking about personality. We just talk about they gaslight, they do whatever, and we have lost the focus on the disorder related to personality and what type of personality that personality might be seeking. And so I think that's where we have gotten off track and not keeping personality foremost, because that's what jumped in my mind. Here's this personality disorder. The survivors have a personality. Wonder what that is.
Right.
And why is this personality attracted? Why are all these survivors so similar that kept coming through through the door? So personality is a key component. If you're going to do this work, you're going to have to beef up on personality theory. We do that in our training workshops. You can find at survivortreatment.com. We spend time in psychopathology. Most of us did not have enough training in that. We spend time in personality science because we haven't had enough training in that, and in trauma, and weave those pieces of that into treatment. So hope you'll join us over there at survivortreatment.com. And when we come back in our next video, we're going to dive in much deeper into the super traits, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.